Yeah, well, so let me welcome you once again after lunch. I know it's always difficult to have the first session after lunch, yeah, but that's how it is. So we will discuss artificial intelligence, benevolent innovator or patent destroyer, which is a significant, interesting topic. With questions such as ramifications of rapid and far-reaching searching, effect on the scope of a patent, implications for data inclusions, proof and plausibility, and related topics. So let me welcome our panel, Julie Barrett-Major, consulting attorney of A.A. Thornton, Steve Gardner, CEO of Row Analytics, Margaret Harnett, Director of Research of GBG PLC, and Peter Richards, Senior Vice President of Business Development, EMEA of the IFI Group. So now it's all yours.
Thank you. Thank you for that introduction, and I'm sorry you've got us straight after lunch. I hope we can keep things lively enough to keep you awake. Certainly, I hope it's lively enough to keep us awake. We want to change the emphasis a little bit now because yesterday and also this morning we've been looking at amongst other things, patentability and exploitability and commercialization of AI itself as such. And particularly yesterday, we were looking at SMEs and their involvement. And today, we've sort of looked at slightly bigger corporations maybe and the issues that they face. But what we wanted to do today was to look now at the interface, not just between AI and IP, but also AI and other technical areas and the applications of AI, particularly in the pharmaceutical and medical arena, which is where I practice law primarily. And I know that this has been quite a big topic of conversation in the pharmaceutical industry. It's quite interesting that yesterday, in response to a question from the floor, I think, Raj Sark of Zupo indicated that we haven't yet reached the stage where AI truly means artificial intelligence. He made the case for saying it's rather augmented intelligence where we augment human effort. Well, today's session, I think, may challenge that view. And that view was even challenged about 20 years ago when Ray Abbott of the University of Surrey, who did a review of AI applications in the Boston College of Law review, said that computers have actually been creating inventions for about the last 20 years. And he said that in 2016. So that caused me to think a bit because I didn't remember too much computers inventing when I first started in the profession. So I had a little look, and he may have been referring to Dr. Thaler's creativity machine, which as far back as 1996 came up with the Oral-B cross-section toothbrush, which I'm sure we all use. That was modelled on a neural network system, sort of mimicking the processes in the brain. And in the same year, there was the genetics programming system, which mimicked the evolutionary process in biology. And by 2010, the genetics programming system had apparently produced at least 2 new inventions in the medical field, which have been patented. So maybe we have reached the stage, and maybe we have long ago reached the stage where computers can actually do inventing, and there is true artificial intelligence. But then since the 1990s and early noughties, of course, we've got big data, which has been a step change transformation in the field. And probably the most famous example of the earliest use of big data was IBM Watson, which was originally developed to, I believe, I've never watched this program, but beat the candidates on the BBC TV programme Jeopardy. But its use has been changed because it did keep beating them, and the BBC said, can you actually stop fielding this candidate? So since 2015, IBM Watson has been redirected, repurposed into looking at solving problems in the medical field. So obviously with the incoming of big data, there's a lot more grist for the AI mill. So as Fei-Fei Li, who's the Google Cloud's senior AI division person, remarked earlier this year, AI doesn't just belong in Silicon Valley, and it very much does belong also in the medical and pharmaceutical field. And I understand that actually most big pharma companies now have an informatics or some department named in such a way where they're combining big data with AI. So, and even Roche this year, the big Swiss company, big Swiss pharma company, Roche, styled itself, instead of a pharmaceutical company, said that now we are a data company that just happens to produce drugs. So obviously the thinking is moving a long way towards AI. What we're going to do is to discuss some of the issues that arise within IP as a result of all these developments. But before we do that, I'd like to ask each of the panel members just to explain a little bit more about their work and their involvement in the field and the work of their company before we go on to questions. So, Margaret, perhaps you would like to start.
Hello, I'm Margaret Hartnett. I've been involved in AI for probably more than 20 years. So I come from the previous generation of AI. I did my PhD in it. I've been through the AI winter, and the AI winter. And I currently supervise a PhD project using deep learning for face recognition, but more generally, I direct research services activities within GBG. I guess a lot of you probably haven't heard of GBG before. It's something I get a lot of questions about. So GBG is a company that is a data intelligence experts. We provide different mechanisms for validating and verifying people's identities using a variety of different modalities, including biometrics, documentary, address information, etc. To date, we can verify, or at least in principle, yeah, we can verify the identities of over 4.4 billion people globally.
Wow.
Okay.
Wow, that's impressive.
I'm Peter Richards. I work for a company called AFI. It's a Norwegian company focused on linguistics, so natural language processing. Our product is used by companies who have large unstructured document sets, so tens of millions of documents, and that need to be, information needs to be extracted. So it's computer reading of text. So we're a text analytics firm. So it's free-form text, from emails to research papers, anything. Any language that exists anywhere, we can read and extract data and insights from language.
Thank you, Steve.
Hi, I'm Steve Gardner. I'm CEO of Row Analytics. We're an AI-enabled drug discovery and precision medicine business. I'm also old enough to have been there 25 years ago in the first wave of hype around being able to invent drugs by computer. But what's happened in the intervening time with the Human Genome Project and the development of electronic medical records and large-scale, high-resolution biomedical imaging and a whole range of other things, as Julie said, we've got access to a lot more data about individual patients. Now, healthcare is a $9 trillion industry, and unfortunately, we waste about, it depends on who you ask, but about 40% of that $9 trillion. And that has serious social and human consequences. So if you can use technologies to better identify new ways of using existing drugs, identify drugs for diseases that have no therapies that are out there, and help people to get the right mix of medicines. That's really what we're trying to use AI technologies to do, or analytics technologies to do, solve all of those three problems. And really, that's very large scale at population level, right the way down to individual solutions for people at a personal level.
Thank you. So when I think about my clients doing their inventing in the pharmaceutical and biotech arenas, that the first step that I really think about is, you know, they've got all this prior art to analyse and to get up to date with. So just thinking about what you were saying, Peter, about, you know, reading all these data, is that really the main thrust of AI and the main way that it can help the biopharma industry?
It's the first step, I would say, of an AI process, is extracting information, and then with that information, you want to put it into a decisioning tool or some other workflow or process. But the first thing is there's just too much information out there, so we have this big data, and you have information that's dispersed, and it takes a long time to read it. And so right now, you know, humans read documents, and humans extract information, and then they make decisions based on it. And it's completely possible now to have a machine read documents and extract data and insights out of those documents. AI has two branches, let's say, or more than two, but two main branches are prevalent today. One is machine learning, where you train an algorithm, and that algorithm is trained with a corpus of documents to say, okay, I know what I'm looking for, so please find this. And then there's this linguistics path. So the company I work for is we map languages, we have ontologies, local grammars, we have dictionaries, so that the machine can identify a subject, verb, and object. It knows when JFK is an airport, when JFK is a president, and when JFK is a street. And so AI has these two routes, let's say, the machine learning, like training an algorithm to make calculations, or to use linguistics. So we're focused on language. So we're not finding things by training algorithms, but by doing extractions using linguistics, using what's called NLP, natural language processing. And that's the first phase in, let's say, discovery, is getting, you know, inputs.
Yeah, yeah. So, but from what you were saying, it seems that we're going a stage further than that. So, you know, by doing what you're doing, we haven't got any invention. We haven't even got a concept for one yet. So is what you're doing taking it further on then? Yeah,
I mean, there are a whole bunch of different ways of using technology. So, you know, Peter referenced machine learning. Machine learning's been very good at improving diagnosis. For example, I work with breast cancer now, looking at what is a malignant tissue sample. You know, a lot of the image analysis technologies are actually much better at diagnosing those than clinicians. Mind you, so are pigeons, so that's not saying much. Sorry if any pathologists in the audience. But yeah, no, I mean, we're using different branches of technologies to really try to identify opportunities for repurposing existing drugs, as I said, finding new targets for therapies that haven't been discovered previously, or even just finding tools that you can use to segregate different patient populations. And I'll give you an example. So many of you will be familiar with the ice bucket challenge, when people were tipping buckets of ice water over their head in support of ALS, or motor neurone disease if you're British, or Lou Gehrig's if you're US. So what they did with some of the money there was go and DNA sequence a whole population of patients. And the upshot of that was that we got access to a data set which had 28,000 patients worth of data, 48,000 controls, full genome sequence. And we were able very, very quickly to then go and start to look at what makes that patient population different from the control population. So it's pattern recognition at that level. The upshot of that is that we found 1,000 new signatures, patterns of mutations that are associated with the disease. And these are all potential opportunities for developing a new drug target. So one of the next things that we want to do is, that we did do, was to prioritize that list of 1,000. And then very quickly, the next question is, well, can we find chemistry that's active against that target? And the answer to that was yes. And so the second thing that we looked at, we actually found a compound that we thought was going to be extremely useful in the context of ALS, which doesn't have any therapy options. And it turns out that Tel Aviv University had beaten us to it. They'd put it into a model of a mouse, an ALS model in mice, and they've proven that this compound is actually active. Why am I telling you this? Well, usually that process, if you were in the pharmaceutical industry, you would probably spend 3 years identifying a target. You'd spend another 18 months validating it. And then you'd probably spend another couple of years getting active chemistry and being able to optimize that chemistry. Our entire process, we took 2 days to prepare the data set, 1 day to analyze it, and then about an hour and a half to get to that active chemistry. And it's the first one of 1,000 things that we've looked at. And that's not to say that we will generate 1,000 patents out of this, 1,000 targets or repurposing opportunities, but it is to say that that whole process was essentially automated. Mm-hmm. We had a couple of bits of human insight into that process, but those are things which could be largely automated. So, you know, there is a change because of the amount of data, because of the technologies available to us. There is going to be a pretty profound change in the way that we discover new medicines.
So at least from a conception point of view, the computer did it.
Largely.
And so, you know, you can see that very soon you're actually, I'm using US language now rather than European language, but you know, there could be reduction to practice as well by the system. Yeah. So that leads to a question that actually it's not so far off that you could have a computer as an inventor. And actually one could argue that Dr. Thaler's computer that invented the Oral-B toothbrush should probably have been named as an inventor. I know this gives you a whole bunch of problems, Margaret, so would you like to just expound on those? And also on the fact that, you know, generally the first owner of any invention or patent is going to, first of all, be the inventor. I mean, it may then be assigned or by means of employment or something. It might belong to a company, but any thoughts?
Yes, lots. Yeah. Well, thank you for mentioning Stephen Thaler's work. It's really very pertinent. You might wonder, why am I interested in this topic? Well, coming from an identity company, I'm fascinated in what is identity. And identity is a hugely complex, evolving, multidimensional, and indeed fascinating subject. And identity doesn't just have to be about people. It can be about organizations. Effectively, it's about what's a natural person and what's a non-natural person. And we conventionally think of non-natural persons as organizations, but they don't have to be. Thinking back to my own history in AI, you know, there's a sort of certain paradox in this. We tend to associate a particular level of what we might consider high-level thought associated with things like playing chess, etc. And we ascribe a lower-level thought practices to what we call common everyday practices, you know, room balancing, all that kind of stuff, driving trucks. Strangely enough, the computer has already beat us at playing chess, but it's damn hard to do things like driving trucks effectively. So what we call everyday common knowledge is not that easy to do. But what does that relate to inventorship? Because we think of inventorship and creativity as another uniquely human attribute. I question that. You've already demonstrated relation to inventorship, but what about the bigger question about creativity more generally? Well, I don't know if any of you have heard of the term generative design. Okay. So in 2013, a group of engineers worked with, I think it was Autodesk. They took out they stripped down the chassis of a motor car. They drove it around, this took something like 20 million sensors on it. No, not 20 million, but massive sensors. They drove it around the desert for a couple of days, and they got a massive amount of data. And they said, instead of doing a traditional CAD where you use an AI to assist a human designer, they let the AI to effectively process this data and come up with a redesign for a motor car. And what it came up with was something that looked a bit like a Geiger painting, a very organic type structure. It was actually quite beautiful. And you also saw that there was different levels of say, reinforcement on one direction rather than to another, and that reflected the stresses and strains associated with turning. So, okay, that's industrial design. Is that creativity? Okay. Well, there's another great example, and this is in relation to art. So you've probably seen the sort of tools that you can already see, which will take the Mona Lisa and Starry, Starry Night and modify it. They apply different filters to it, like animalistic filters, etc. Is that creativity? Probably not. But then, I don't know if any of you came across this, but there was some work done by a gentleman called Ahmed El-Gamal, and he created an adversarial network which learned how to reproduce artistic styles and then produce images which conform with generally accepted norms of art, but distance them from existing styles. The art, when compared with a selection of images at a flagship contemporary art fair in Basel in Switzerland in 2016, the audience found it very difficult to tell the difference between a human-created art and art created by an AI. Now, you might wonder, where does IP fit in here? Well, we've already talked about the ownership of, or who's the inventor, or who's the creator of an artistic work. I forgot to say also, for my sins, I'm also a patent attorney. So, yeah, identity is a huge thing for IP, because ultimately it's really nice to be able to identify who created the work and who ultimately owns it. But you know what? The more and more I think about it, it's not an issue of IP at all. We try to bend IP law around it. But you know, when we're talking to our clients and we say IP is just a form of property, it's no different from any other form of property. In which case, when we talk about ownership of IP, should we treat it any differently from the way we look at ownership of any other form of property? What is the characteristic which enables us to determine whether something is capable of owning a property? Well, you might call that legal personality or legal capacity. Legal capacity to enter into a contract and legal capacity to bear liability. I don't know if any of you have been keeping up to date with activities in relation to the European Commission and the European Parliament. The European Parliament last year produced recommendations to the European Commission in relation to establishing a legal personality for robotic systems. Okay, I'm going to be quick. Now, I'm just going to read it to you because the wording is kind of important, and it also gives you a sense of the reason and the rationale behind this. So the wording they used was, it included creating specific legal status for robots, wherein the most sophisticated autonomous robots could be established as having the status of electronic persons responsible for making good any damage that they may cause, and possibly applying electronic personality to cases where robots make autonomous decisions or otherwise interact with third parties independently. So you can see that the main motivating factor here is about liability. Now, think about where this discussion is primarily happening at the moment. It's happening in relation to autonomous vehicles. That is, who bears liability if an autonomous vehicle accidentally plows into a crowd of people? Is it the vehicle itself? Is it the owner of the vehicle? Is it the renter of the vehicle? Who is it? So you can see where this discussion is really coming from. In this attempt, they're trying to suggest that it is the robot or the autonomous vehicle, whatever it is, that bears the liability in the event of something happening. Now, I would argue, and you can disagree with me if you like, that if we're going to say it has to have the ability to bear liability, it has to have some means of providing redress. How do you pay on a liability? That means the AI must have some means, whether it's a service or property. It doesn't really matter what form of property it is. So, where have we moved on from there? Well, in early 2018, over 150 experts from well over 14 countries signed an open letter to the European Commission where they criticised the European Parliament's proposal on the grounds that personhood is not necessary to meet liability concerns. You remember, the primary driver here was about liability. Also, the argument was that the creation of legal personality for AI is legally and ethically inappropriate. It's inappropriate in relation to existing national principles of legal personality. In April 2018, the European Commission outlined its future strategy for AI, and very interestingly, the capacity for AI to have electronic personality went unmentioned. But they did stick a very interesting little footnote, where they said, reflection will be needed on interactions between AI and IPR from perspective of both IP offices and users, with a view to fostering innovation and legal certainty in a balanced way. Ah, yeah, that leaves it wide open. But you know, it's not just, this stuff isn't just happening at European level. There's actually very interesting stuff happening at the national level. I don't know if any of you have been keeping up with legislative changes in Malta. Malta is a major centre for online gaming. And recently, the Maltese government enacted 3 pieces of legislation in relation to interactive technology arrangements, or innovative technology arrangements, which could embrace cryptocurrencies and distributed ledger technologies, which is a broader version of a blockchain. The discussions are currently going on about providing legal personality to a DAO. I don't know if you know what a DAO is. A DAO is a distributed autonomous organization. It is an organization which, for example, could be implemented through smart contracts under an Ethereum platform. Blockchain and DLTs operate under a consensus mechanism. Consensus mechanisms can be implemented through an AI. So through this 4th piece of legislation, the Maltese government is implicitly suggesting there may be basis for providing legal personality to a corporate entity controlled by an AI.
I mean, this is interesting because a couple of weeks ago I was in India at the Association of I'm going to get the wrong title anyway, but it's the Asia Pacific Patent Attorneys Association, and one of the sessions there was representatives from each of the countries concerned in the Asia Pacific region, representatives of their local organisations who had been discussing with their government whether it would be possible actually for a computer or some systemic thing to actually be named as an inventor on any patent application. So, you know, one has to assume, first of all, that we think that's acceptable. And then if it is acceptable, and there are obviously arguments pro and con, as you've pointed out, Margaret, you know, will the law need to be changed in order to allow for such a possibility? And it was interesting because every single one of those countries, which included Australia, New Zealand, India, China, and many other countries, all came to the conclusion that not only was it not currently legal in their territory, but as far as patents were concerned, copyright was a different matter, as far as patents were concerned, they didn't actually want to allow a machine to be given legal personality or to be able to be an inventor. So there's obviously quite significant difference around the world in views on this, but I think we've probably talked for long enough. Can I open to the floor? Are there any questions arising either on what we've discussed or any new questions on this whole area of the interface between AI, IP and its applications, particularly in the sort of pharmaceutical, diagnostic-y kind of field? There's a question here. Could you just wait for the mic to come to you, please?
Oh, sorry. Hi, I'm Alia Chowdhury. I kind of work in R&D tech transfer, so I don't necessarily come from a legal perspective, but I have to say, first of all, it's been very engaging learning about both the AI theory side of things and the application. And I think this question applies to everyone, really. Do you think that AI is bringing us back down to earth, thinking about inventions being a creative process and it actually really being a sort of a problem-solving process. I mean, certainly when I work in R&D, we talk to engineers about solving problems and the solutions being sort of inventions, and novel solutions being a sort of a patentable invention. So really, what AI is just doing is confirming that it's just with enough knowledge and input, it's just a problem-solving process, and therefore it's quite valid to think that, you know, with more and more knowledge and data, that it's maybe contextual and perhaps different for different industries, but just as a generalization, do you think that's a valid way of looking at it?
Steve, what do you think? AI just a problem-solving tool?
Well, I think at the moment, you know, AI is a misnomer, as you said earlier. We're not in the era of general AI. We're at a point where we have algorithmic solutions which are either very good at pattern matching or they're very good at optimizing a solution. And, you know, I think of what we do using analytics and AI effectively as a really smart filter. So it's taking a ton of contextual information and being able to apply it to find a solution that works better for a particular subgroup of people. You know, in the pharma industry, this is about, instead of having a single blockbuster drug, which, you know, let's be honest, was probably developed and trialed in 35-year-old white males, and making sure that it actually works effectively across a whole population. And if it doesn't, picking one that works better. So that's at that sort of level. Essentially what we're doing is filtering through data very, very efficiently. My challenge is, you know, twofold, I guess. One is that a creative enough step to be able to claim an invention? And if it isn't, why isn't it? Because that's kind of what we've done as humans anyway. We've just dressed it up a little bit more. But then the second challenge I have is, if I can do this at scale and I can do this, you know, across a whole disease population with 10 or 20 potential inventions in that space, you know, what does that, two things. A, how much of how I do it do I have to disclose to prove an inventive step? And secondarily, what does that do to the landscape of innovation around that particular disease area if somebody is capable of taking all of that, that intellectual space? So I think it does pose challenges, but I don't think, as we sit here at the moment, yes, we can spot connections that haven't been made yet, but I think much of what we do is not taking that innovative leap that perhaps we expect when we talk about innovation.
Okay, thank you. Any other questions? There's a question here.
Hi, I'm just wondering that given that AI is so good at data analytics and can go through the pattern recognition so quickly, or potentially significantly quicker than a human can manage that, from a patent perspective, obviously we've got an inventive step or potential inventive step problem. If you are simply doing pattern recognition, I'll say simply because AI is a black box as far as I'm concerned. But do we also end up with a potential plausibility issue if we don't put enough data in the patent application to say, actually, I've proved that it works in not just 35-year-old white males, but I've got this population data for a wider population? Are we going to end up having to either limit the patent to a particular population in which we do have data, or could we possibly use AI to extrapolate from that and try and use the AI to prove that we've got data that supports the broader invention?
Anyone like to answer that?
Well, I mean, I can
go for it.
I can go for it, absolutely. I mean, yeah, this is actually part of the whole process of the transformation of medicine. As I said at the beginning, is about being much more specific. It's not the blockbuster model of you have this disease, therefore you get this drug. we know that that doesn't work. The question is, how do we get beyond that? So the challenge from my perspective in the scenario that you're raising is that the models that we use are continually changing. As we bring new data in, as we bring new populations in, those models are continuously changing. So being able to replicate you know, the findings and the invention is almost impossible. And I wonder whether that's actually a more practical limit to what we can claim as inventions compared to a traditional state of the art.
Question the far side there.
I'm a patent attorney. Isn't what we're seeing really the problem that we're sort of dancing around on the head of a pin here with old constructs in law to deal with a new paradigm in AI? I mean, you know, inventors are dead. Invention doesn't happen anymore. And all that really matters, really, is that we find things that are new. So the only thing that matters is novelty. So isn't it time to think that we need to change the whole way we look at this and not try and work out how we can take AI and put it into a human construct pot?
Peter, would you like to?
I know I'm doing myself out of a job by the way.
Time to retire.
I have a comment.
I'm sorry, I'm a bit confused, to be honest with you, about the question. I mean, I think that...
Change the law.
Yeah. I mean, the first thing is to realise that, as you mentioned, AIs are, I use the word in the plural, because there's a lot of different types of AI, and also because they're remarkably narrow. I mean, you know, they're designed to solve specific problems. Generalization is the technical term used to describe the ability for an AI to go beyond the scope of the data with which it's been trained. But that in itself is an art form. I mean, designing the training data for AI or ML, you know, even if it's a traditional multivariate statistical tool, is an immensely difficult task. It's the sort of thing people don't really talk about, but most practitioners would say they probably spend most of their time actually doing it rather than actually using the AI itself. So the idea that you can have an AI, I suppose what you're heading towards is what we used to call a weak and strong AI. And nowadays you hear it as narrow and AGI, general intelligence. And that's where you're going beyond the scope of its programming itself. So, I mean, have you seen Sophia?
No, what's Sophia?
Sophia is a cyborg. She recently was granted citizenship of Saudi Arabia.
Yes.
She looks remarkably humanoid. Now, I watched her at the Web Summit in Lisbon earlier this year. And what I was struck by was the conceptual idea of combining multiple AIs through a blockchain so that you get something approximating to an AGI through the synergies of narrow AIs. Mm-hmm. But that assumes that those synergies are possible in the first instance. I'm not sure that it is. When you're saying that an AI could make an inventor obsolete?
Invention's obsolete.
Invention's obsolete?
If you just,
well, I think, can I just come in here? Because I understand completely what you're saying. But I have had 40 years in the business, I regret to say. And during that time, obviously, I've seen a lot of changes, including the fact that there wasn't biotechnology when I was at university, for example. And, you know, in the mid-'80s when it all kicked off, I had to learn very fast. And because of that history, I've seen a lot of changes in the law to adapt to new technologies. Now, this may be another big step change, and I completely take that, and I'm not comparing the two things. But I think the principle is similar. So, for example, when we first started in biotech, trying to patent gene sequences, for example, or indeed anything that was found in nature, we got around it by just simply saying and isolated whatever it was that was found in nature, and lo and behold, you can get a patent on it, because the whole technology around isolating it from nature was new and it was difficult and people couldn't routinely do it. Now, of course, it's routine. Everyone does it. Everyone's got a machine that can do it, who wants to do it. And so patents now are not granted for isolated, well, certainly not in the US, for isolated sequences of whatever. So the law and the case law and the interpretation of the law changes as technology changes. And I think what we're on the cusp of seeing here is another change. So I don't think the law will change in terms of you've still got to be novel and non-obvious. What will change is our criterion for assessing non-obviousness. And maybe to come back to, you know, Steve's area, what we may see, and I kind of hesitate to suggest this because, you know, one wouldn't want this necessarily to happen in one's lifetime, but you might start finding that we need to put more data in because the bit that the human might be able to do that the machine can't do. I mean, the machine can make the connections and say, well, you've now got this biological pathway that's relevant to this disease or this patient population. You've got this drug out there already, which we happen to know can hit this pathway, but has never been used for it before. So you've ticked the novelty box. You could then make an argument to say, well, it's the machine that's come up with these connections, therefore in a human context it's all obvious, but it's not obvious because it's not obvious it's actually going to work. So you have to do some testing. So maybe we're going to see an increase in the requirement for data. I mean, my heart kind of stops at this because, you know, the idea of having to put even more data into our patent specifications is a bit alarming, and particularly on the pharma side where you may be looking at full-blown clinical trials in the end, which cost a great deal of money. But I think what will just happen is that the criteria by which we assess things will change rather than those basic tenets of the law will change.
Can I come back very quickly on that? I think one of the things that you're touching upon is the degree to which a particular technique that's been used has explanatory power. To explain its innovation. That isn't always obvious with neural nets, and in fact the more data you put in, the less intuitive often many results become, and the more changeable they become as you get new data. I think it's particularly in the area of medicine and pharmaceuticals, being able to tell people why a particular medicine is going to work inside an individual, precisely being able to see which metabolic pathways are being impacted and what the functional significance of a particular mutational profile is going to be in the context of a pharmaceutical intervention. That is where I think we're still going to have invention that is intelligible to humans and therefore potentially patentable. I think we're really going to struggle when we're talking about neural network models.
Do you think that we're talking really about what's the difference between incremental innovation and what's radical innovation? Is that what we're really talking about? And if we're talking about incremental innovation, let's be honest with you, probably the vast majority of patent applications and inventions are incremental. Yeah. Let's be honest about it. The number of radical innovations, tiny. So maybe, here's a thought. What if instead of making the act of invention obsolete, rather it just reduces it to truly radical innovation that cannot be achieved through a narrow AI?
Or just novelty.
Yeah, but how novel is novel?
It doesn't matter. Everything that's new is new.
I've just been given the timeout signal. Saved by the card.
Thank you.
Thank you all so much for coming and listening and participating. It's a thought to go home on.
Yeah, well, thanks a lot to the panel. Also very, very lively and intensive discussion. Yeah, let me now introduce our next standalone presentation, Creating and Embedding an IP-Centric Culture Within Your Organization. I think that's something we all have on our agenda. to get IP more into the attention of board members and management teams. So, we have here Richard Nugent, Head of IP Strategy of Collar IP, and Fernando Vasconcelos, Director Investment Strategy and IP Valuation, also from Collar IP.
Good afternoon. Ooh, it's a real pleasure to be here. This is my colleague Fernando Vasconcelos. It's a real pleasure to have the opportunity to speak to you all, and I hope we can do this justice for you. So I'll kick off. Hopefully this wee timer will go nicely for me here. So yeah, we're going to talk about training today, and it's very high level. But I think it's important that we just think about training in our organizations. A little bit first about Collar IP. We've been around for quite a while, and recently we were acquired by Matheson Squire Patent and Trademark Attorneys. So it's a great synergy in how we've come together, and we deal with a whole range of services here, whether it be the consulting, the valuation, or even coming in on renewals. This is our team, and we don't need to spend too much time on that slide, but we're all very happy to work with you, and we've had a range of experience over many years in many different types of organizations, and that's really what's bringing us to the point where we're able to say to others, yes, we feel we'd be happy and able to provide some training. So we work across the world. There's Fernando in Singapore, and but we also work in other places like Barnsley. There's Alex up there working away and giving some training, and that's actually in an accelerator environment. So we were able to go into that accelerator and really help that organization to engage a little bit more with the whole concept of IP, because for many organizations, that's where the people are. They're not at a place where you and I are, perhaps, we're really maybe quite into IP, we like IP. As you know, sometimes not everyone thinks that way. And certainly we've been fortunate to have the opportunity to engage in other countries as well. There's Lawrence, my colleague in Thailand. So we offer a range of consulting services right across the piece, both in the elements mentioned here, and also with respect to valuation, which Fernando is going to come on to in a moment. But within the general consulting services, we're looking at strategy, IP management, brokerage, helping companies engage and get their IP license out to third parties. But also what we'll talk about most today is the IP training. That's our key focus of today's discussion. Fernando, do you want to say a little bit about the valuation? I think you're...
Well, just as an introductory slide, well, hello everyone. I'd just like to have a show of hands. Who has actually done an IP valuation before? Okay. I'd like to learn, I think, at the end of the talk as well, what the purpose for the valuation would be quite interesting. But what we do very concisely is we look at the due diligence of the business and its financial opportunities that are underpinned by the intangible assets or intellectual property rights. And that's done by a thorough due diligence and economic modeling of the opportunities. And this really informs us both on the IP valuation, but also on IP transactions. And as I'll be discussing on the next part of the talk, we really try to stress the valuation training aspects to large corporates, SMEs, and also startups that are just learning on their path to developing an IP-rich culture within their institution.
Okay. So if we come on to a little bit more about the sort of things that Collar IP is doing and how we engage with organizations, we're not solely focused on the intellectual property, the assets themselves, the patents and the trademarks. We're also interested in looking at the intellectual assets in a business, how people engage with the business, the types of ways that we're looking at know-how perhaps, but going beyond that into intellectual capital, what are our contracts like? What is our branding like, and how are we dealing with other parties? third parties. And what are those relationships like, and how does that impact our IP value, and how does it impact what we're doing as an organization? Now, we want to talk about a little bit about training. And, you know, from our perspective, training is absolutely vital. And certainly for employees, training is absolutely vital. And oftentimes, it's not the thing that we all have bandwidth to engage in, because our roles are just so busy. Now, Edison here, he said that there's a way to do it better, find it. And that is the big question for many of, like, if we look at R&D departments, but also in general teams and companies, they're looking at better ways to do the job they're doing. And sometimes they find the better way, and that's great, but then when it comes down to it, it's a case of, well, what do we do with that, and is that knowledge being captured? And sometimes not so much. So training is a key part of that, and helping people understand, is it possible to capture that knowledge in the organization. Now, sometimes this is the reaction to IP training when you talk to your staff, and you maybe talk wider in the organization. It's a bit like dental treatment, or this young lady here, she's not looking too happy. But I mean, we understand this. I mean, everyone probably here in this room has at some stage maybe been involved in delivering some training to an audience that's not very interested. And the question is, how do you engage people further into training? And it's not always standing behind a lectern like this. It's much more about interactive training styles. And we like to get in amongst our audience rather than you know, standing up here on a raised platform, which isn't perhaps always the best way to engage with a group. But active participation is key. And certainly getting people involved in exercises and workshop type activities can be a very good way to keep attention and engage attention. And sometimes we also get involved in using IP games, and this can be a great way to embed knowledge that people have learnt during a session of training, but it allows people then to get the competitive juices going a little bit. And it's a bit of fun as well, but also it's good fun. It's fun that people are getting something out of. So there's a number of key topics. I mean, we do all sorts of IP training. We come in from the earliest stages of the why would I even bother with IP? You know, those sorts of questions for employees at an early stage, but right through to auditing and licensing, and how do we engage on licensing, and what are the key skills people need. And here we are again up in, I think that one's in Barnsley. And yes, there's Lawrence there again. That's just very recently in Thailand. So we're involved across the world in training, and it's something we're key. We find that companies are very interested in engaging with what we're doing. So IP searching, just as a quick example, the sort of things we get involved with on the searching. You know, these are some key themes, but really what the key aspect to the training that we do is it's all about, you know, talking to companies, understanding what their needs are, and then once you've understood their needs, delivering to those, rather than just delivering anything that is suitable to us, but now not suitable to yourselves. That was okay then. I'll pass on to Fernando.
Thanks very much, Richard. So the next part of the talk, I'm going to be describing intangible assets and IP valuation. So I'd like to start by asking the question, right, how can firms actually generate access returns? That's one of the fundamental questions that a lot of companies have. And I think the way forward with a knowledge-based economy, it's quite clear, I think, for all of us in the room and many of who we engage with, is identifying and monetizing intangible assets. First, it's identifying them, knowing how to capture them, and then how to use them in the best benefit of the company, of shareholders, et cetera. And in that sense, we have to really think about understanding that, performing a thorough due diligence on the assets, and then trying to see how can we actually invest more in assets that can generate better return. And I like to point out that enterprise value, I mean, as everyone knows, is intangible assets and tangible assets. Now, if we look at enterprise value, there's a portion of this that are the tangible assets, there's a portion that are disclosed intangible assets, but there's a portion that are undisclosed intangible assets. But how can companies actually make better decisions and analyzing all the assets that they have? So intangible assets, they're really the most important assets of any successful company. And this graph here on the right just shows you, it's different sectors. It's difficult to read, but I'll give you a sense. Up on the upper side, the dark blue is, let's say, advertising software companies, where the tangible asset is a small fraction of the intangibles that's composed of the light blue, the gray, and the green. As you walk down this curve, you can see places or companies, sectors that are like real estate, although they're incorporating artificial intelligence, pricing methods that are driving the intangible assets to the left as well. One thing to note is that all of this curve is driving to the left. And more firms are developing more in terms of the software and other intangible assets that would drive the business forward. Now, this is the other key, I think, thing that, or concept that we try to teach colleagues is, I would submit to you that any kind of business decision or financial decision whatsoever, it boils down to two things. One is valuing an asset or an opportunity, and the other one is managing it. Once you know how to value or have a range of values, because it's never about a single number, then management becomes really easy. You just take the asset that has the greater value. Now, this, of course, has to do with knowing your purpose, your objectives very clearly. So once you've defined your purpose and objectives, and you've worked out your valuations, then you can perform your business or financial decisions. And again, this is not an exact science, and a lot of things are actually taking into account and analyzing the market conditions, business opportunities, et cetera, in order to make valuation a negotiation tool. It's a starting point to start discussing opportunities. Now, this can be used in various purposes, if you will. The major ones would be valuations for investments that we deal with on a regular basis. And we teach corporates and also small SMEs and entrepreneurs how to negotiate investment rounds, how to raise funding, how to actually do corporate share value transactions. And the list goes on. And we try to work with them, as Richard said. The whole team is really hands-on. So we work with them, really trying to ask questions. And it's more of a discussion, teaching them on real examples. What is the business? What are the intangible assets? How does it support products and services? How does it actually generate revenue? So it's a really interesting, I think, a journey that we take on with them to discover what they have in the company. I think one thing that we've had a lot of, let's say, good feedback on is these IP valuation masterclasses, where we train their corporate functions to actually perform IP valuations themselves. So we work with them for maybe 3 days, 5 days, and then we continue supporting them through exercises that they value, take decisions, touch base with us to see if it's the best way forward. And as Richard says, we also link this with the searching element, with the landscaping element that underpins the due diligence as well. So here's the training that we did for Platcom. It's an innovation agency in Malaysia. We've also done several other trainings across the world with corporates and also SMEs. This is another training example, again, very hands-on. So we invite colleagues to say, what are problems that you have that we can work in the classroom, that we can actually work with you to understand so that you can make more informed decisions. So this is another training that we developed this year in Turkey. So a lot of these colleagues, they're from innovation agencies, corporations, or other companies that are interested in learning themselves and then spreading the knowledge of that IP is important. We're not going back. Intangible assets is key. We need to know how to value them in order to make more informed decisions. And I think with that, I just wanted to invite as many of you as possible to an event that we're hosting at Matheson Square at the Shard. It's going to be in late January, and we really want to try to have a very engaging discussion with you. So if you're interested, please come by booth 6, and we'll send you more details on that. But we really want to try to understand from you, what is it that you want that we can actually work together and develop a project in consulting, in landscaping, searching, and evaluation. So thank you so much for your attention, and I think we'll take questions.
Thank you.
Are there any questions in the field? For those that did IP valuation, can you describe what was the valuation for, the purpose? Say again? Mergers and acquisitions, I'll say. Were we on the buy side or sell side?
We wanted to acquire.
Okay.
So to look into the portfolio of the company to be sure that we were not buying empty dots.
And how was that experience for you?
It was brilliant. Yeah, it was good. It was really interesting. Just looking to the, I'm a trademark attorney, so my focus was mainly on the trademark portfolio. We saw that a lot of trademarks that were there were already cancelled or abandoned.
Yeah.
So we really focused on the few that had a value for us.
That's excellent. Other show of hands, who else worked with? Yes, please.
We also did it for due diligence.
Can you use the mic, please?
Sorry.
Thank you so much.
We also did it for several due diligence projects, but the most interesting one was to prepare the company for exit.
Excellent.
And to find out what are the gaps, what can be done in addition in the short period in order to increase the value. So it was really challenging.
Okay. I think, yes, please.
Technology transfer to universities and corporate.
Excellent. That's a reoccurring theme. So technology transfer between universities is something that a lot of government agencies are asking, corporates as well, that also want to partner with startup companies and SMEs, absolutely, and that, you know, a lot of the research is coming out of the universities and institutes.
It's particularly difficult because the IP is at an early stage.
Yep.
So it's a challenge.
That's right.
Fernanda.
I think we're out of time, but please, if you have any questions, please come by. Thanks for your attention.
Thank you very much.
Yeah, thanks a lot. Valuation is very important. I fully agree. We always need that for M&A reasons, yeah? But not for tax reasons in our countries. Yeah, now coffee break, and we will be back, everyone, at 4:05.